Hi everyone, thanks so much for your patience. I'll try to keep my introduction short, so we can move on quickly to the screening. It's a real pleasure to introduce the Otolith Group's third part of the third measure, a film they did I think last year. It was a commission from Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia and Sharjah Art Foundation. And it's a film they describe as an experience of watching in the key of listening on the work of Julius Eastman. Kojo and Anjali, our dear friends and brilliant artists, the Otolith Group, will introduce the film after. I will just briefly mention a few things you may want to know. It will be showing at iBeam on Tuesday, June 5th at 6:30 p.m. again with a conversation with the great Jace Clayton, DJ Rupture, many know him as. Their exhibition, A Lost Future, the Otolith Group, will be on view at the Rubin Museum of Art with an opening on Friday night, I think around 6 p.m. Yeah. And curated by Beth Citron. Following the screening, Kojo and Anjali will be in discussion with the great music scholar George Lewis and the great artist and performer Travis joining us tonight. Just to introduce our guests tonight, the Otolith Group is an award-winning collaboration whose practice spans the moving image, audio, performance, installation, and research. Founded in 2002 by the artist and theorist Angelika Sagar and Kojo Eschen, the group engages with the cultural and political legacies and potentialities of non-aligned movements, new media, black study, Afrofuturism, and Indo-futurism while thinking speculatively with science fictions of the present. George Lewis is professor of American music at Columbia University and area chair in composition, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Travis is a black Native American male born in 1946 in Itawamba County, Mississippi. His work springs from a performative approach to race, gendered space, and colonial objectification, and spans calligraphy, drawing, painting, live art, performance art, and design. And he is also a part of the band Ono. Please join me in welcoming Kojo and Anjali.
Thank you all for coming. Wow, and thank you for your patience. There's so many people here and so many good friends, and thank you. I'm not going to talk too much about this video that you're going to see. Except to say that we made it to be an installation. So what you're seeing here is a split-screen version of an installation piece, which is quite expensive to kind of like produce, and it has to be in a certain context. But we are happy to present the film in this format, and we have done quite a few times. Because it kind of allows for a kind of different conversation, maybe, because people can come see it, we can talk about it. So I hope you enjoy the film.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for making it across town to come and see third part of the third measure. It means a lot to us to show this work in New York. We're here as part of a whole series of events we're going to be doing over the next week or so in New York. As Brian said, third part of the third measure will be shown at iBeam. But tomorrow night, we're in conversation with Nissi Shaw, the great science fiction writer. If you haven't read her book, Everfair, you should. It's a great novel about what would happen if the Congo had not been colonized and extracted by King Leopold. So we're going to be in conversation with Nissi Shaw at the Rubin Museum tomorrow at 6 p.m., at 7 p.m. So for anybody who wants to come along to that, please get in touch with the Rubin Museum or with Beth Citron, who's here. And Then on Friday, our new video, which is called O Horizon.
Plugging.
O Horizon, which is a new video that we filmed in Shantiniketan, the famous art school founded by Rabindranath Tagore in 1921. That's going to be screening with its premiere at the Rubin, opening on Friday. So it'd be great to see some of you there as well. So hopefully there'll be a lot of opportunity to be in conversation. So we're going to screen third part of the third measure. Then George Lewis is going to make a response to the work. Then we're going to be in conversation with George. And finally, we're going to round the evening off with the great Travis, who was at Northwestern University in 16th January 1980, when Julius Eastman stepped onto the stage of the Pick-Steiger Hall to present his compositions. So, we're kind of 1 degree away from that event. So thanks to Travis for coming in from Chicago to join us here today. So without further ado, we're going to go into the third part of the third measure and see you on the other side. Thank you.
Good. Well, let's see. This film has provoked so much thought and emotion that I feel like my sort of poor reflections, don't really match up with it. So, but I'm going to unburden myself anyway. And in fact, right now, I want to thank Anjali and Kojo as the Otolith group for creating this incredible piece, and I also wanted to thank them for including me on this. I had some relationship with Julius. I toured with him in my music performance days, and I was certainly around at the time when he was most active, at least in the New York the downtown New York scene of the late 70s and early 80s. And so this is, I hope this is 15 minutes. They told me to talk for 15 minutes. I hope this is 15 minutes. If not, please excuse me. But it's sort of just the idea of Eastman, and I wanted to get into what the idea of Eastman was. And you just saw this, the third part of the third measure. It presents a performance of Julius Eastman's 1979 work for multiple pianos. In this case, 2 pianos, 4 hands. The work is called Evil Nigger. And of course, it takes as its text as a speech by Eastman that prefaced a controversial concert of his music at Northwestern University in 1980. All right, Northwestern. More on Northwestern in a minute. Most of the commentary, in fact, right now, really, most commentary on this speech notes Eastman's reference to a little problem with the titles of the piece. Gay gorilla, evil nigger, crazy nigger. And in fact, that resulted in their eventual removal from the printed concert program. And I understand that, Travis, you were there for this concert. So this is going to be a bit of speculation. I'm wondering if I can verify this. Now, most often in stuff I've read about this, the black students and one faculty member Eastman mentions are implicitly regarded as, rather dour, Comstockian. I mean, why were they objecting to the use of this word? But you have to take into account, I don't know, you were there, but the fact that by the time of this concert, at least a generation of black Northwestern students. You were there in 1980. I'm talking about people who were there in the 70s, including future AACM members, Chico Freeman, Adego K. Steve Colson, Iqua Colson, Janice Lane Ewart, all students of Fred Anderson, who was living in Evanston at the time. These people and many other, the very few black students on campus, had long been beset with widespread campus racism. As Chico Freeman recalled, being attacked by groups of whites, attempt to run us over with cars on the campus, fights in the gym, name calling we got walking down the street. Now, in all probability, that one faculty member, was that a black faculty member? Do you remember?
No.
No.
Well, that was not a black faculty member.
Not a black faculty member.
Rejected, but he stood with the black students. There was also black faculty.
Well, that was interesting, because if you look at that one faculty member, if that person had been black, might well have been the only black faculty member. Now, in 2018, the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education reported that Northwestern's complement of black tenured faculty in 2007 was just 2.9%. Now, that's a better record than where I teach, Columbia, which is 1.8%. At no major institution did that number come up to 6%. Also reported in this issue of the journal was the late Columbia University sociologist Manning Marable's report that in 2005, of the 400 professors with tenure at Columbia's College of Arts and Sciences, only 5 were black. I was one of the 5. Imagine what those numbers were like 38 years ago. So it's clear that at Northwestern, people might have understandably not have been quite fully ready to support Eastman's invocation and exegesis of a word that they were already hearing routinely from fellow students, probably some faculty, and the community overall. This is Chicago, the place where I grew up, or Chi Congo, as Joseph Jarman called it. The virtual disappearance of Eastman's sonic and historical presence within just a few years of his untimely passing recalls an African-American composer of an earlier generation who my colleague Ellie Hissam at Columbia told me about. This is Julia Perry, who was born in 1924 and died in 1979. Passed away just as Eastman's work was beginning to become more widely noticed. Perry attended the Juilliard School of Music, studied with Nadia Boulanger and Luigi Dalla Piccola, received 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, and won prizes for her compositions in the US and Europe. Nonetheless, within a decade after her passing, nothing more was heard of her work for many years, a situation which remains the case. Or we could think about Eastman's view of himself as a, quote, talented freak, unquote, in the context of contemporary music. And that recalls for me the blind slave pianist, Blind Tom, who could play anything at the piano on first hearing and became known even in the final days of American slavery for the virtuosity of his performances, the audacity of his compositions for the piano. Blind Tom, for example, discovered and used the so-called tone clusters in 1863, about a half decade before Henry Cowell was credited with doing the same. And his compositions were published. You can read them. But even Tom, who was once one of circus producer P.T. Barnum's grandest exhibits, disappeared from American history for many years after his death. Now, this kind of precarity of the place of blackness in new music histories is more recently exemplified by the historical reception of the work of Benjamin Patterson, who, despite having been highly regarded by artists as a central figure in the emergence of Fluxus, remained a cloudy figure in histories of the movement. Now, this is where I get to talk about you, Fred. A critical theorist Fred Moten's identification of, and this is a great quote you should all remember, a vast interdisciplinary text representative not only of a problematically positivist conclusion that the avant-garde has been exclusively Euro-American, but of a deeper, perhaps unconscious, formulation of the avant-garde as necessarily not black. This, I think, accounts in part for the myth of absence that we are discussing here, which was memorably expressed by Kojo Eshun, actually, in a brilliant lecture at Berlin's Savvy Contemporary in March 2018. Quote, "The work of forgetting the black avant-garde never ends." But, okay, but who is doing that forgetting? You know, I'm not a poker player, but I at least want to, you know, what's that phrase? See you, Kojo, and raise you a little bit. on this portrayal of this dynamic in the same lecture as, and this is a memorable phrase as well, a form of collective agnosia. Now, I want to imagine this agnosia in the spirit of Donald Trump as collusive rather than collective. You know, no collusion, no collusion. To highlight the role of witting agency rather than simple forgetting. I emphasize witting collusion because so often attempts at redress are met with the disclaimer that no one is actually responsible for the problem, as in a now forgotten corporate racial discrimination case from the 1990s, settled for $176 million, where a corporate executive was heard on an auto recording in response to a lawsuit by black employees, joking that somehow all the black jelly beans seemed to be glued to the bottom of the bag. Even as the important African-American musicologist Eileen Southern warned in a 1973 issue of the magazine Black World that if we black folk are serious about our commitment to the rediscovery and the redefining of our heritage in the fine arts, our scholars must take it upon themselves the responsibility for developing an appropriate and exemplary literature. Now, despite all of that, the fact is that the black classical composer has been almost entirely ignored, not only by the white-dominated field, but also by the major black cultural critics and public intellectuals who have come to prominence since 1960. This, what we see tonight, is actually the beginning of a huge opening in that. Thus, Fred Moten could be speaking not only about present-day, highly reviewed histories of contemporary and experimental music by white scholars, but also about, let's say, Amiri Baraka's lack of engagement or even disparagement of African-American classical music. Now, in the film, the visual presence of the score and the responses to it by the performers, all that's crucial to establishing the classical. From William Grant Still's 1930 Afro-American Symphony to the symphonies of Florence Price, from Hale Smith's 1975 Ritual and Incantation to Courtney Bryan's Yet Unheard, an oratorio detailing the final moments in the life of Sandra Bland, African-American classical composition continues to reference black life. In that light, rather than being a form of bourgeois assimilationism, as it is often portrayed, the entry of Julius Eastman and other black composers into classical music becomes an oppositional stance where the idea of Julius Eastman problematizes not only dominant conceptions of black music, but also fixed notions of high and low, black and white. And of course, when the Otolith group creates a film about black experimentalism, the resonances move beyond music to become intensely self-reflective about the implications of their own positions as fine artists. During his time, Julius Eastman was known and admired not only for his compositions, but for the resonance of his voice. I mean, this voice is inimitable, you know. There was a little problem with the titles of the piece. Look, I heard that voice many times. Not just the singing voice and the resonantly cultured, self-fashioned speaking voice that one hears on the 1980 recording. The film portrays two Eastmans and two Eastman voices. This, along with the split screen, becomes an evocation of double consciousness, a sign under which the multiplicity of black lives and black liveness becomes subsumed. The first voice is cool, a matter-of-fact Afro-diasporic man apparently explaining his views first to his piano, perhaps, and then to an intently listening Afro-diasporic woman. The second is hot, with that same woman reading in a very improvisative way, even singing the text in a way that recalls the passionate, poetic performances of Jane Cortez. Now, the white folks who have just performed Evil Nigger in such a sensitive way seem to be taking in her impassioned words with equal sensitivity, and at times, the first male Eastman is intently listening to his alter ego, just as the female Eastman encountered hers. In between the two monodramas, the viewer encounters music of the kind US audiences virtually never see on either mainstream or alternative channels, whatever the race, gender, or sexuality of the composer. On the film, we see intensely moving fingers, but intermixed with faces to avoid the kind of faux ethnographic finger fetishism so subtly critiqued in Stan Douglas's 1994 video installation, Or Chant, which portrays two contrasting views of jazz creativity: the standard jazzistic view of obsessively oscillating body extremities on one side of the screen, and a humanistic view of faces, intelligence, and communication on the other. Douglas obliges the viewer to choose a standpoint. Otolith's visual aesthetic overcomes the fetish by emphasizing the poetry of the physical amid the intensity of faces. While Eastman is now belatedly acknowledged and is an important early minimalist, a properly post-genre portrayal of minimalism would also engage the impact of John Coltrane, a major influence on the composer saxophonist Lamont Young and Terry Riley. The McCoy-Tyner piano solo on Coltrane's 1960 recording of My Favorite Things, for example, is essentially a minimalist improvisation using repetition as a primary element. Both Coltrane and Eastman, in fact, deploy an ecstatic affect that is well represented in this film's two-piano, four-hands performance of Evil Nigger. With Eastman, though, minimalism becomes a kind of referential, endless shout. You know, like James P. Johnson's canonical Harlem Stride piano, it was kind of a test piece for the period, the Carolina shout, the giant steps of its day. So before I conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit about the titles of the piece. But Eastman's peculiar intervention was to introduce specifically African-American tropes of highly politicized vernacular resistance into classical music, into a classical music world in which these tropes have been in really short supply. Now, as with Zora Neale Hurston's joking account of the 1889 Johnstown flood in Mules and Men, she says, everything that happened, there got to be a nigger in it. Julius Eastman puts niggers on the classical agenda, not like Manet's Olympia, but like Jeff Donaldson's Aunt Jemima and the Pillsbury Doughboy, if you've seen that massive painting. Thus, even in the midst of contemporary classical music, Eastman makes common cause with the far more conservative legal scholar Randall Kennedy, who once insisted, never give up your right to be a nigger. To reference Homi Bhabha, Julius Eastman's interruption of the circulation of the stereotype of exclusive whiteness around classical music's self-image counters the impoverishment and devolution of the field that has resulted from the consistent absences of the same ethnic, racial, and gendered voices from music histories and professional networks. Now, I want to suggest that for many artists and audiences, as these real, not mythical absences become increasingly noticeable, a form of anxiety and even despair sets in, which the current desire for the idea of Eastman seeks to overturn. Eastman's spirit of audible and sensuous adventure exemplifies a new creolized formation, affirming that Black liveness can be a part of contemporary classical music. Now, about that evil nigger stuff, Frantz Fanon's view that the myth of the bad nigger as part of the collective unconscious turns out to be just a part of the story. Later, Toni Morrison, speaking with an interviewer, seems to be describing Eastman himself when she speaks of the bad nigger as, quote, a free man who could do a lot of things, This is a man who is stretching. He's going all the way within his own mind and within whatever his outline might be. Sometimes you see it when they do art things, sometimes just in personality and so on. They might end up in sort of 20th century contemporary terms being also unemployed. When I came back from Paris in 1986, I ran into Julius on the street. I said, "How you doing, man?" He says, "I'm living in a shelter." I said, "What?" More on that, but you know the story. Go back to Morrison. They may be unemployed, they may be in prison, they may be doing all sorts of things, but they are adventuresome in that regard. In another interview, Morrison sees, quote, a wildness that they have, this special lack of restraint, a part of human life. It's in black men, despite the reasons society says they're not supposed to have it. They may call him a street nigger, but when you take away the vocabulary of denigration in its exact phrase, its exact sense, what you have is somebody who is fearless and who is comfortable with that fearlessness. It's a kind of self-flagellant resistance, opposed to accepted notions of progress. Now, Eastman seems to be saying pretty much the same thing. Most are afraid to admit to the world who they are, he says. People fear punishment. There's always somebody who is trying to crush you. I refuse to be afraid of my own comrades, of being castigated, thrown out, or thought of badly. What I'm trying to achieve is to be what I am to the fullest, black to the fullest, a musician to the fullest, a homosexual to the fullest. It is important that I learn how to be. By that, I mean accept everything about me. Okay, Julius Eastman certainly wanted to be all these things to the fullest. But was he simply revaluing the term nigger toward a normalizing valence? Or was there a more radical agenda at work? To explore this question, in my own performance on the same conference as Kojo at Savvy Contemporary in March 2018, I used a sample of the audio recording of the Eastman speech, but I inserted a nearly subliminal edit into his declaration. That is the reason I use gay gorilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. So my edit went, and nobody noticed. That is what I mean by nigger, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. The African-American composer Alvin Singleton's string quartet, titled Secret Desire to Be Black, written in 1980, presaged the emergence of, let's say, Rachel Dolezal. However, when she decided to become black, did she also believe that she was signing up to become a nigger? Do you want to be a nigger if called upon to be one? Now think before you respond. On a recording I made in 1992, Changing with the Times, you can hear an actor playing my father, telling a story about me. As I recall, he told this story in front of all his friends. He said that when he informed me, I was 5 years old at the time, and he said that he informed me that, you know, you are a nigger. I burst into tears. He turned to his friends and said, look here, nobody wants to be a nigger. Now here we can look at how Glenn Ligon reframes the classic Richard Pryor joke. I was a nigger for 23 years. I gave that shit up. No room for advancement. Finally, I find it surprising that few have framed Malcolm X's widely known analysis of the house Negro, field Negro dichotomy as an obvious precursor to Eastman's notion of the field nigger as, quote, fundamental, unquote. Eastman's discussion of his nigger pieces at the 1980 Northwestern University concert invokes one pole of Malcolm's well-known dichotomy between the house, or good nigger, whose obsequious acquiescence to oppression values survival over freedom, and the field nigger, also known as the bad or evil nigger, the embodiment of upfront resistance. Malcolm saw the field nigger trope as the engine of radical change. The field Negro, said Malcolm, had nothing to lose. Eastman's sense of intersectionality draws him to invoke the same image about the gay gorilla. So to conclude, I find it particularly noteworthy that the Otolith group has created one of the vanishingly small set of films. I mean, you can go to like MoMA or the Whitney or the Guggenheim or wherever, I usually go to the video section. And there are all these films about, Meredith Monk and John Cage and Michael Snow and everybody. But, but I feel like telling these people, don't you know that Zora Neale Hurston said everything that happened has got to be a nigger in it? So the Otolith group has created one of the vanishingly small set of films to present a kind of black experimentalism that lacks overt links with jazz, funk, hip-hop, house, or other forms deemed by mainstream culture and its aspirants as genetically best suited to understanding the black experience, as if there are only one such experience. But as the late Muhal Richard Abrams observed, we know that there are different types of black life. And therefore, we know that there are different kinds of black music, because black music comes forth from black life. So anyway, that's it for now. Thanks. Already. Is my supposed to be in the center? Or? Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, is this working?
Hello? There's that button. There you go.
Okay, so we're going to have a conversation for about, I think we can talk for about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And hopefully there'll be time for some questions as well, some thoughts from you. And then we're going to hand the stage over to Travis. I just wanted to start with one point, George. I mean, when we show the installation, there is this large text on the wall outside. And it kind of gives you a kind of cast list. So the first figure who speaks is a poet based in London and a researcher called Dante Michaud, who works on the relation between Alan Locke and Edward Carpenter. So he works on the relation between kind of anti-imperialist homosexual culture of the late 19th century in relation to the formation of the Harlem Renaissance. And then the woman at the end is Elaine Michener, who's probably the most outstanding performer in extended vocal technique in the kind of UK experimental and improvising scene. And then the four pianists are probably the most renowned exponents of Julius Eastman's music in the UK. So the chap who does the count up is called Zubin Kanga. And then the older pianist is Rolf Hines. And then the woman with blonde hair is called Siwan Rees. And then the fourth woman, we call her the Vermeer lady, the dark hair. That's Eliza. What's Eliza's surname? Can you remember?
McCarthy?
Yeah, Eliza McCarthy. And Zubin told me that there were only 20 pianists who can play Eastman's music in the UK. Only 20. And so we saw these four performers first in December of 2016 at a London Contemporary Music Festival, which devoted 3 nights, 14th, 15th, 16th of December 2016, to Julius Eastman's music. So after 9 years of listening to the Unjust Malaise CD, I mean, just listening to it over and over and really being a missionary about it, being a fanatic and a zealot, just like imposing it on people, forcing it on people. Finally, we had a chance to see and hear the Eastman's music performed live, and it was truly revelatory. And since 2016, there's been performances here in New York at the Kitchen, at Philadelphia, but also in Berlin, and also in Oslo. So to the extent that you know, people recently talk about a phenomenon of Eastmania, a mania associated with Eastman. What is this mania? And what does it have to do with, I thought the most compelling point, one of the many compelling points that you brought up, George, where you talked about, you said, as the realization of the real absences within experimental music become noticeable, and anxiety takes shape. And it's this anxiety that is assuaged by the turn towards Eastman. Part of what animates the turn to Eastman is the desire for a kind of encounter with black liveness, which seems to suture the confrontation with that anxiety. Could we talk a bit about that relation between that anxiety about real absence and then the way in which black liveness in the form of Eastman is in relation with that anxiety?
I've been talking for a while.
I mean, so much that you said was so clear and brought many thoughts to bear in terms of you know, many questions. And I think it's quite relevant to think about this term blackness in American context. You talked about the Otolith group and us as artists, and I kind of find myself constantly having to think about this term. I mean, maybe this will add to what Kojo said in terms of an absence, but certainly when the Otolith group began, it was begun in relation to a history of friendships that spanned between, let's say, politically between India and Africa and African-American politics. You know, there was a series of definite friendships that were present that I grew up with. My mother was, my grandfather worked in Washington, and she grew up she was there as an Indian child when she was 14, growing up within apartheid in America. So my relationship to blackness was always a place to disidentify. It was intellectually with a kind of potentiating force. It allowed this force to of disidentification from the kind of racialization that was kind of present in Britain in the 70s. The black avant-garde gave me as an Indian Indian, British, Asian, whatever you want to call it, you know, growing up, this sense of how to think around the ergonomics of freedom, you know, more seriously. And I think it's, you know, when we started with the Otolith group, this question of being continually questioned around identity in a policing way, especially in Europe. It's important to remember that in the rest of Europe, there really haven't been that many kind of multicultural projects, right? Which is why we kind of see the rise of fascism. Well, it's not why, but you know, it's one of the reasons maybe that it's kind of so easy to sort of, you know, take hold as such. So this question of you know, blackness for me has to be complicated, because I say this in an American context because when we showed this film in ICA Philadelphia, when I talked about this, a lot of the young black members of the audience were like, "How can you call yourself black? You're not black." which I thought, I didn't take personally. I was just like, well, you have to think about it in a kind of British context where, you know, maybe some of you have heard about the Windrush, you know, generation who came in the 1950s to the UK, who are now being, you know, chucked out. Then you have to think about what that means in terms of an attack on the heart and soul of a kind of certain resistance in Britain, which comes from people like John La Rose, the leader of the Black Parents movement, the Black Nurses movement. And then you have to think about Stuart Hall, who said, if anyone asks me where I'm from, if I ask anybody where they're from, I expect to be told a very long story. So, you know, it's like this question of, you know, Caribbean is where Indians and Africans and everybody's Irish, God knows. London, a port full of everybody. London is a port of the motley crew. We are the motley crew. The motley crew is black. And as a space of disidentification with the powers of identification which are going on now, which are about sort of, you know, in terms of invasion, just the sort of the kind of speculative technologies that are mapping our faces. I mean, we're in hard times, you know. So, I thank you for that, you know, sort of comment relating to the Otolith group as a kind of almost like a, you know, what I'm trying to say is that the idea of it was intentional, to stop people asking us where we're from in an ignorant way, let's say. So, sorry for all that roundabout comment.
No, that was fantastic. I mean, you know, I mean, this is really part of what I think something that allies Eastman's project with that of the Otolith group. I remember talking to some journalists the other day and talking about the late 1970s in New York and noticing the extreme paucity of, let's say, African Americans in the American sense of blackness in that scene. I mean, Ben Patterson, nobody could find him. So there was Bill T. Jones and me and, I don't know. I mean, it's an extreme minority. So, and the thing is that in that sense, disidentification with standard tropes of what it meant to be black in a scene were sort of both allowed by that scene, but also looked at as rather quizzical. People didn't quite know what to do, and Julius being an extreme case of that, be coming in with the idea. I mean, a lot of people didn't know how to take discussions about race. They were ill-equipped to deal with it, and it came to a head not so much with Julius's work, but with what happened in the early 1980s, when suddenly people started noticing these extreme absences in new music, perhaps the first time, still unprepared as to what to do about it. But certainly there was a lot more discussion of it suddenly than there had been before. And this anxiety of which I spoke earlier, I think you also see it on the European continent as well. There's starting to be small movements in which people starting to address these absences in contemporary classical music, zeitgenössische Musik, Musik contemporaine, or whatever you call it. So in each of these scenes, regardless of the major countries, you know, whether it's France or Germany or whatever, what you see is these people are around, but there's no evidence of their histories. And so we find is the idea that somehow we don't need to listen to black liveness doesn't matter in these environments. It's basically a question of carrying coals to Newcastle. So we already, I mean, why do we have to listen to you lot? I mean, we're the music, you know, we're the music people. What do you have to tell us? So that's a very clear attitude, which is very difficult to overcome. In that environment, I think that Eastman, the focus on Eastman, what you call it, Eastmania, is laudable, but if it stops there, it becomes unsustainable and will result in the same kind of anxiety over and over again. The problem is that there are a lot of Julius Eastmans out there. There are a fair number. And the thing is that perhaps focusing on just the one, if not carefully countered, becomes a form of tokenism. Yeah. So, and I'm not trying to say that this film is about that, far from it. As I said, this is it's an intervention in a field of massively asserted whiteness about experimental music. So, and it'll be great if this could be more widely disseminated. But in the meantime, just seeing it, it gives one hope, I think. Yeah.
Maybe we should ask.
Yeah, there's so much to think about. Mm-hmm. Just before screening this here in New York, we screened it in Manchester, and a theorist and a historian called Louis Chude-Soke, he was there, and he said he'd been hearing about Eastman for years, but he'd deliberately avoided ever listening because he'd become increasingly fed up with the focus on the kind of focus on the martyrology of Eastman and a kind of tragic narrative. So and he was anxious that the music couldn't live up to or support or bear the weight of this tragic discourse, which he felt was in a way almost salaciously repeated. So he was talking more about articles, reviews, journalism. He said which kind of obsessively returned to like features of Eastman's life, his blackness, his gayness, his black gayness, his black gay radicality. They would continually reference this, but he wouldn't go deeper into these. It would just circle around them. And all of this left him with a certain kind of trepidation. So he'd avoided listening for years until seeing the third part. So he hadn't heard Unjust Malaise, he hadn't heard Feminine, he hadn't heard the Zurich concerts, he hadn't heard Joy Boy. He'd stayed away from it all. And then his confrontation with it was through this kind of audiovisual presentation that we made. And I wonder how many people are at least as much turned off as so many people also appear to be turned on by Eastmania. I wonder how many people are wary of what you talk about, these kinds of patterns of fetishism and fixation, tokenism, all of these kinds of symptomatic, compensatory dynamics that play themselves out in the present, all of which seem to be responding to part of this kind of anxiety that you talk about. What I thank you for is the fact that you brought up a genealogy of names from, Grant Still to Benjamin Patterson and many more. That's the kind of opening out of a kind of sonic geography. A geography of experimentation, which also opens up to a kind of widened geography of minimalism itself, a minimalism that encompasses many cartographies. I think that's, in a way, we tried to make this video, and it's the key was, could we stay in that studio in St. John's Wood? We filmed over 2 days. Could we stay there? No cutaways to the external world, just there. And could this like focus inward, this binding of the gaze inside and around the piano, could that inwardness nonetheless be a bridge to this wider geography? Could we show a geography by an inward focus? That was part of the proposition of the work. I don't know if we succeeded, because because in a way we need to have more conversations around it.
But I also, just to add to that, the camera, there's many aspects of the piano that can be used in a piece of music, experimental music. So I think the camera allowed us to look at the surface of the piano as a kind of site of refraction and reflection, the black mirror of the piano. Eastman talks a lot about light, doesn't he? The kind of, as a kind of play on the kind of let's say the kind of safety of the idea of the Enlightenment, he kind of throws it back. And Glissant also, Edouard Glissant, the poet, talks a lot about opacity, which is not a place of absorption, although it is, but it's a place of absorption which also refracts light. And for us, the kind of black mirror of the piano became a kind of site of doubling, of tripling, of also reflection, refraction, but with the lighting system above the pianos, we could reflect into, and you then use the camera to kind of produce a sort of many different kind of, let's say, images, which to me kind of extend the tonality, the kind of the harmonics of the music itself. So that was just another intention that we hope that we kind of worked with in the edits, etc.
Maybe we should go back to the audience for the few minutes we still have. So does anybody have any questions for George, for Angelica, for myself about...
I just want to say it's very exciting to be here between these two. We've had lots of private conversations about these things, but never like this.
Hi, good evening. Kojo and Angeli, thank you so much for that brilliant representation of Eastmanism. And George, my question is actually directed to you. There's a quote by Baldwin, James Baldwin. It talks about Negroes dying out of all proportions to their numbers, dying in jails and in the manhouse, right, and on the streets. And so your encounter with Eastman, while he says he was in a shelter, and I want to kind of recall us to like the different modes from Dante and also the other performer, which says nigger over and over and over and over again. And I'm wondering, given Baldwin's kind of telegraphing of the outcome of the black male, how did you assimilate or reconcile Eastman's social life? You talk about black aliveness, right? And there is this black, not death, but a loss of kind of human energy that he was sharing with you. How do you reconcile or assimilate or make sense of that, given what we've just seen and given what you know of Eastman's career?
Let's see, that's, let me relate this to what you said, Kojo, about Louis, Chule Soke, and the idea of not wanting tragedy to be the defining, in other words, everything that you hear and read and see about a person, about a composer, about an artist, it could be Van Gogh, and the idea of cutting off his ear, or it could be some awful thing that you hear about some other tragic person, Charlie Parker. There are a lot of similarities with the way Eastman lived and how he was considered and how he was thought of. And there's a sort of, he was under the sign of enigma, much of the time. I personally don't believe that many people, even the ones he lived with, even his lovers, really knew him. There was a sense of masking about who he was. And I think on that day when I met him outside in the streets in Midtown Manhattan, he was still, it didn't take much for him to tell me that he was living in a shelter, but he didn't want to say where it was, and he didn't really want that much to be known about it. And he certainly didn't want me to go telling people that he was doing it. But this is another thing. I would say that I was a little concerned when you said that Lewis had avoided listening because of these external narratives, because these external narratives are actually not external at all. They inform classical music more generally, stories about Wagner, Beethoven, any of the so-called greats, whoever it is. They all have interesting stories about them that we have to deal with. And a lot of so that in the end, those inform our listening. So we can't be afraid of that. We have to listen through it. The alternative is to try to cordon off the space into what, I guess it was Pierre Schaeffer called a kind of reduced listening, where we're just listening to, quote, the music itself, this convenient fiction, which is now come a cropper with changes in the way musicology is thought of. So when I listened to today, when I was watching the film, it reminded me of what you said, Baldwin, I think that works, but also of the phrase from Invisible Man, where the guide says, keep this boy running. Keep this nigga running. Run, nigga, run. Run, Lola, run. Whatever it is, you know. And you hear it right away. He's on the run. I mean, that's like, a standard classical music trope of movement, action. It's almost like a scherzo. He's running. He's on a horse. He runs for about 40 minutes. Then he gets tired.
Sustain as well, isn't it? It's a sustain.
Yeah, it's a
sustained kind of. Right. Yeah, I mean I think the piece has. I mean, it's difficult to talk about what it does for one, but there is a kind of sustained sense that is constantly being returned to, and then, yeah, it is a run. It is a movement. It is locomotion in a way, but a locomotion that is constantly returning in on itself.
There's one more thing before I know you have more questions, sorry, but there's one more thing I wanted to point out about this business of was it the mulatto, did you mention so at some point? Did you talk about that? Let me talk about that, because Julius Eastman, like a lot of African-American or Afro-diasporic classical composers, and it's an important thing to remember that Eastman's intervention is in the world of classical music. Let's say the next year, instead of giving it to Kendrick Lamar, they give the Pulitzer Prize posthumously to Julius Eastman, because they can do that. That's going to be a very different kind of signification. And so it points to a very different model of what blackness is. I think when Lamar got the Pulitzer, we were told that this was an authentic voice of the streets that was suddenly being elevated to high culture. But a lot of it could have been as simple as just saying that finally someone got a reward in music that the journalists had heard of, and as distinct from the anonymous figures like, I don't know, of the past that no one knew about. So in the case of someone like Eastman, he becomes a kind of tragic mulatto figure, caught between multiple worlds of signification, racialized regimes, and having to negotiate those through a kind of cosmopolitanism, but also it's a very difficult thing to do, and you might resort to all kinds of strategies in order to survive in an environment like that, where no one really understands what you're doing, or very few people do. And this is something that when I read Amiri Baraka, I see a failure to understand what these people were doing. One of the smartest people we know couldn't figure this out. So at that point, you start to think, well, where do we go for sustenance, for solace? Okay, you say evil nigger. Guy says, well, wow, nigger. Why are you using that word? That's amazing. Can I say nigger too? So suddenly you're in a space of a liminal space, and this is something that I think we can learn from in a way we can empathize with. We can use the example of Julius Eastman to investigate our own liminalities. Could be one way of thinking about it. Sorry.
Got time for how many more questions?
You know, we only had one so far. Sorry, we were filibustering here. Sorry about that.
Anyone else?
Come on, y'all, say something now. You know, just, you're not gonna let Rich be the only person to say something now. Well, oh, there's somebody right there. You got somebody right there.
I wonder if you could speak about the decision to make this, cast this, direct this, create this in the UK, and if you thought about coming here to do that, because I guess part of my thinking was that as an introduction to the work and as an introduction to the film, my initial feeling was that it was there's so much that's biographical about it, and then towards the end, when you had the second, when it was bookended by the second reading, and to hear that British voice, it seemed to be inclusive of something else. So I was just wondering if you could speak about that.
I'm more interested in what you think that inclusivity means.
I don't really have an answer, just other than my initial impression was that it was a little bit biographical, because of the poet who spoke in the beginning, and it didn't. And I actually thought that because it was produced in part by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, it didn't dawn on me that until you mentioned that you had shot it in the UK, that's in fact where it took place. So I was just sort of putting pieces together and thinking about and then listening to your own introduction to his work and how it's been, or not your introduction, but your response to how it was played, or your reception of it in the UK over that festival that you mentioned. That also seemed to have another effect on the making of it. So there are just all of these components that I was wondering how that affected how you put it together.
I mean, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was actually just quite curious as to what that... yeah, I mean, I think after we made this work, we showed it in Philadelphia, and then a friend of ours called Greg Tate said, you know, in relation to Eastman, he said, and the kind of Eastmania, he said, when there's trouble on the streets, the white avant-garde come calling on ours. And I watched the Eastmania take place in London. Suddenly there's this huge room of kind of hipsters with beards and everything, all sitting silently, listening to Eastman, lots of white people listening to Eastman. I was like, that's interesting, you know. But I was, you know, I used to work in theatre, and I created a group of theatre, music theatre group, and over 2-3 years, and held this kind of ensemble together. And what I became aware of was the kind of extreme racism within the music schools towards black experimental musicians. This stereotypes or the, of what black music is. How the classical music kind of world became a kind of regime of like, almost denial of different kinds of experimentation going on in different forms of musical practice. So I had to kind of protect this ensemble from these readings of what a London black music scene was to this music theatre director I was working with called Heiner Goebbels, rather unfortunate name. He wanted to stage the black and Asian musicians in front. And I said, listen, mate, you can't do that in London. This is all the same shit. Everyone's in the same shit. You cannot put a black DJ, because he was interested in the kind of gestures and whatever. You cannot put like someone who's good on the decks in front of the Trinity musician on the piano. Let's just forget that. That doesn't happen in London. Why London or why Britain? Because I think we have quite a good resistant kind of occupation with this, which is hard to describe what it is. What is it? I think of it as a kind of form of mutational aesthetics that have been there for a long time. There's been writing, black writing and Asian writing in Britain for 200 or more years. So this kind of question of what is black, what is Asian, what is this, what is that? I mean, this is Luddite, I mean, we are thinking with kind of complexity in relation to these terms that are put on us. So we all, this kind of hype around, blackness is coming out of America, but everyone forgets about what's going on in Britain. It's been going on for a long time without kind of staging itself. In America, it's a very different situation, which we've always learnt from. But this work, we're not. I mean, I'm just telling you what I feel in general. We didn't make it because of that. We are in Britain. We are feeling these things, we're experiencing these frustrations, and we love Julius Eastman because he speaks to our ideas, and he speaks to our ideas around mutation, intersectionality. We are, I suppose, people would say now, we're queering these, we're trying to queer ourselves and our ideas around race, gender, class all the time. No one talks about class. We talk about Eastman on the streets. I mean, what's happened to the streets, right. As a place where we can find some hidden space to be?
I mean, there is a certain, maybe critical biography or maybe, a sociography, maybe a kind of an inventory that Eastman speaks to, because, certainly there's a way in which I've listened to Eastman maybe more than any other musician of the last decade, i.e. that one album, Unjust Malaise, like more than any other recording of the last decade. But each time, that listening is and cannot be distinguished from a certain fear, a certain dread and a certain horror, because each time I have to confront the fact that Eastman is largely unknown, and I keep on the idea that music like Eastman's did and could and did disappear. That fills me with great horror, so that the pleasure I feel is indistinguishable from a kind of horror, a horror that work of that nature could disappear, deliberately be disappeared. And then that horror is indistinguishable from an anger, actually, like a real anger at that project of erasure and the implications of that. And then that anger is linked to the moment of making the work when Mark Fisher committed suicide. And so those moments are indistinguishable from those other moments. And so, you know, when George lays out for us a kind of, you know, this moment from Blind Tom to William Grant Still, from William Grant Still to Julia Perry to Eunice Waymans, of course. You know, just 10 years before Eastman entered conservatory, Eunice Waymans, who was not yet Nina Simone, was refused entry into conservatory, and then had to fashion herself as what would become Nina Simone. But she wasn't Nina Simone then, she was Eunice Waymans, also a virtuoso, also a brilliant composer. And then Eastman, and then of course Cecil Taylor. So that lineage, in a way, you know, these questions of horror, dread, and anger, and kind of actual rage, actually. And Elaine talked about rage as well. Yeah, when Elaine Mitchener, before she did her speaking part, she told about how after 4 years of music study in London at one of the top music colleges, it was after she graduated that she heard about Eastman. And when she said it, she was still really angry about it. Like, how could you go through 4 years and not encounter his work? Why did you have to encounter his work in this way? And what do you do with that once you have it? So in a way, you know, I had never not been thinking about making this work. I just didn't know how. And we would talk about Eastman all the time, but I didn't know how to do it. And somehow the opportunity arose. And the question was how to keep faith with these, the structure of feeling, the structure of dread and anger, which is indivisible from, you know, the ecstatic nature of what Eastman is doing. The question was how to honor that, and how to create a certain kind of steadfastness and a certain kind of resilience, and then finally how to analyze, how to work with Eastman as what Glisson calls a prophetic vision of the past, because this is, you know, those speeches are set on 16th of January 1980. As George said, it's 38 years ago. So how to not only commemorate, but how to create a prospect, how to make Eastman come from his past towards his future, which is our present. So these were the things we were thinking about. These are the things that obsess us, and maybe there is no other subject than this, how to continually invent a prophetic vision of the past. Yeah, maybe.
Thank you.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that's a moment at which...
16 January 1980.
Exactly. So at that moment, we'll pause here, because it's a conversation maybe I hope to have with George for the rest of my life, really, in one way or another, and thank him for being with us. And we're going to step away and give the space to Travis. So thank you.